Good evening to everybody, and welcome to this September's Acting for Justice gathering. My name is Jack Jezreel. I serve on the staff of Just Faith Ministries, and I'm delighted you could join us tonight. So let's begin this evening in prayer. And I invite us for the next few moments into silence as we reflect on the world tonight, a night in which millions of people in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Florida are navigating damage, power outages, and loss of life. A night in which the Russian people protest, evacuate, and suffer the loss of loved ones in the mindless war of their leader. A night in which the Ukrainian people suffer the same mindless, vicious war on their homeland. And so I invite you, each of you, to call to mind some place where people know suffering, and pause for a moment with that place in your heart. Let us pray. To our merciful God, we pray for those places that seem merciless. To our forgiving God, we pray for those places where vengeance and division pervade. To our compassionate God, we pray for those places forgotten or hidden from our notice. To our loving God, we pray, help us to see what we can do and inspire us to do what we can. This is our world to love. Be with us and make us free. Amen. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speakers, but I'm going to pause for just a second because in the chat somebody said they're hearing an echo, and I wanted to check to see if other people are hearing the same echo. No, it looks like no. So the person who asked, just know that it must be on your end. I apologize for that. So now back to our speakers. Politics, at its best, is the place where peoples etch into law who they want to become. Politics is the public conversation about values and priorities and what constitutes the beloved community in so many words. And although imperfect, one of the activities of democratic politics is the vote. You might have heard that there's an election this November. One of the organizations that has been most adamant about the importance, the mandate, the necessity of people of faith bringing their religious values into the political conversation is the organization represented again tonight by our two speakers, Network. Network has been inviting, urging, even cajoling people of faith to engage in the political process for over 50 years. In fact, 2022 is their 50th anniversary. So tonight is the second of two presentations provided by our friends at Network addressing the upcoming election. And joining us tonight are Sister Emily TeKolste, one of Network's grassroots organizers, and Colin Martinez Longmore, Outreach and Education Coordinator. Sister Emily and Colin, welcome. We're delighted that you could be with us.
Thanks so much, Jack. We're so glad to be here, and I'm going to go ahead and share the screen to get us started. As you can see, the theme of our conversation tonight is your vote is your voice. Your vote is important, especially in a democratic system like we have. So for those of you who are less familiar, Jack did a great job introducing us a little bit. And I'm just going to dig a little bit deeper into who we are. So Network is a federal lobby that educates, organizes, and lobbies for economic and social transformation. And so we seek to build our country anew by dismantling systemic racism, cultivating inclusive community, rooting our economy in solidarity, and transforming our politics. And we do that in these 5 policy areas. They're rather inclusive. Our economic security, our healthcare, housing, and food policies, our taxes, our democracy, and our immigration and justice systems. That all sounds very wonky, but the reality is we know that policies affect real people in their real lives. And so we will translate some of this into everyday language for you tonight. But we're here especially to talk about the fact that who we elect matters. Who we elect matters deeply, and so we must be engaged in politics. As you can see behind my head, Pope Francis said, "A good Catholic meddles in politics." And so here we are to meddle with you and impact our election in positive ways so that we may together become Pope Francis voters. So our goal for this evening really is to build a multiracial, inclusive democracy. We've been doing some work on training people to be Pope Francis voters, and we define a Pope Francis voter as a multi-issue voter willing to do the work to build an inclusive, multiracial democracy. And this both requires and is a vision for solidarity. So let's talk a little bit about solidarity. Why solidarity? Well, it starts with pure self-interest because inequality is bad for everyone. And here's a chart developed by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, public health experts, in their book, The Spirit Level. And the headline really says it all. Health and social problems are worse in more unequal countries, worse for everyone in more unequal countries. And that's true in individual states within the United States as well. The data looks very similar to this data of just about every similar nation to the US across the world. We're all worse off when we are more unequal. And we are more unequal in the US, as you can see, than all of the other similar nations in the world. And we also have the worst health and social outcomes. We want to change that, right? Like we can do better than that. So again, why solidarity? Well, because equality has to include everyone. And for too long in our nation, it hasn't. So the simple answer to why solidarity is found in the title of Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. So that is, we choose solidarity because racism costs everyone. Here's a little piece of the story that she tells. Following the great growth of the white middle class in the 1940s and 50s, the movement for racial equality ramped up. You all know this history, right? And in that time, certain politicians saw an opportunity to use this tension to deepen divides and stoke racial resentment so that they could dismantle government supports and build an economy that works for the ultra wealthy instead of for everyone. And then in the years since then, we saw dog whistles like Welfare Queen and Law and Order used to gut a social safety net that benefits white, brown, and Black people, and to send people of all races to prison so that they could line the pockets of private prison corporations and provide massive tax breaks to the ultra wealthy who funded their campaigns. Certain savvy politicians used unconscious racial resentment to convince most white people to act against their own interests. But we can fight back against the strategic use of racism to take away our freedoms, and we can do so in a way that wins. It's what happened with the Fight for 15 movement and continues with the union campaigns at Amazon and Starbucks. And there are so many other examples. It's led by people of color and built on cross-racial organizing. Heather McGhee calls it the solidarity dividend. That is what we all get when we act in solidarity. And it depends on the story we tell. So it's important to think about what story we tell. Do we live in a zero-sum world where more for me equals less for you? Or do we share the truth that more for me equals more for you, and more for you equals more for me, and we are all better off when we're all better off? And we must come together despite people trying to divide us to build that world. So we're going to talk a little bit about all of that today in a little bit more depth. And before we do that, I'm going to turn it over to Colin to take a little bit of a look back at our first session.
Thank you, Sister Emily. Hi, all. Glad to be here with you this afternoon or evening, depending on what time zone we're calling in from today. As a review, before we dive into a little bit more of the skills and the topics that we're going to be looking at today, we want to look back at our first session back in August to review on some of the pieces there. I know we have some folks here that might be joining us for the first time. If so, welcome, or some folks that are returning as well, just to lay a ground of understanding that we could all be on. So at the beginning, the main thing to start of our big idea from our first session was the idea of becoming what we call a Pope Francis voter. And what is a Pope Francis voter? For us at Network, a Pope Francis voter is a multi-issue voter. And we understand that it is immoral to allow a single issue to outweigh candidates' positions that can harm immigrants and asylum seekers or low-income family, people of color, those in the LGBTQ plus community, the environment, or anyone else that is in the overlap of those identities. We know that focusing on a single issue allows other social sins to continue unchecked. Things like environmental destruction, economic exploitation, harm to immigrants, racism, and so much more. In recent years, Pope Francis has echoed hundreds of years of church teaching, and when he's spoken clearly and forcefully about the demands facing Catholics in the public sphere, and especially in a time now like leading up to the midterm elections. As a Pope Francis voter, we know that we cannot support candidates whose policies worsen economic inequality, sow division, racism, xenophobia, and impose greater harm on the most vulnerable. Racism and economic inequality are systemic problems. So because of that, they need systemic solutions. We need policies that can advance racial and economic justice. As we say a lot at Network, excuse me, as we say, policies are what got us into this mess, and it's policies that can get us out as well. So we encourage people of faith to listen to their own conscience and to embrace an expansive, inclusive agenda of political priorities instead of a narrow one, knowing that we each live multi-issue lives, and we should reflect that when we take our faith into the ballot box as well. The other big thing that we talked about in our last session was the skill building of having a transformative conversation. We know that the most important requirement to change a worldview is not a very clever argument or a one-liner, right? Or finding a video or resource online that you could send to someone and tell them to do their own research. But the thing that really can change a worldview of a person, this thing that is so ingrained in us for so long since the start, is an authentic and a respectful and a long-term relationship. So having a transformative conversation allows us to, one, do this in that long term through an authentic and respectful relationship, usually with those that we love and that we may have a tough time talking about difficult issues with. So we went through each of these steps that allow us to be able to save those relationships and continue the conversation, continue the relationship that can build that trust and can ultimately change your worldview. Some of those steps start with being curious at the beginning and entering with a heart posture of curiosity rather than one of confrontation, which leads into listening to understand, which is a tough thing to do, right? I mean, listening is tough in itself, but especially when it's during maybe an argument or a discussion about an issue that we can feel very strongly about and someone can feel the opposite, we can sometimes not listen to understand and just really wait for our own turn to speak our mind, right? So instead, if we can sit and listen to understand where that person is coming from there, we review what was said in order to make sure that what was said is actually understood between both parties, leading to the validation of how someone feels about that, letting them know, yes, it sounds like what you're saying sounds like it was very frustrating to you. And once we can do those first 4 steps that are very other person focused, we can connect onto that last step of expressing, where we can connect and expand and share from our own place of expertise, which is our own lived reality. Those steps, are not something that happen only within a 15-minute time frame. They're definitely not something that's only going to happen online and in the comment section. It's something that's going to happen over a long period of time with those that we're in relationship with. But that ultimately is the most important requirement to change a worldview through those authentic and respectful relationships. So through these 2 pieces, we're going to build on that a little bit more, dive deeper, and expand on some other pieces that will be very helpful for you all as you continue the journey through this midterm election season. Ballots have already gone out, votes have already been cast. So already the midterm election is well underway right now for many folks. So we want to make sure that we feel prepared to be those Pope Francis multi-issue voters for this upcoming election, knowing that it's so important to do that now. But before we do that, we have a little bit of time of small groups that we have for you all. It wouldn't be a workshop led by Network if we didn't have small groups. So what we're going to do is give you all a very few short minutes. It won't be very long at all. But you'll have some time to basically review some of the homework that we had left you all with our last workshop. And what that was to have 4 conversations within that month's time, which is 1 conversation per week, following the transformative conversation framework that we talked about. After each of those conversations, we invited you to reflect at the end of those. How did you feel? What do you felt went well? What might be something that was a learning that you could do differently next time? And to reflect on those things. But since we know that there might be some folks who are joining us for the first time, we want to invite you to reflect for yourself on this question at the end. If you weren't there for our last workshop and weren't able to do the homework, that's totally fine. We invite you to reflect on who is someone that you would like to have a transformative conversation with. Who is a person that you're in relationship with, that the relationship could be strained because of a specific conversation, and that you'd like to be able to engage with them in a transformative conversation. So we'll give you all a few short minutes. It won't be very long. And then you'll each have about maybe 2 minutes to share. And then we'll bring everyone back in, and hopefully we can hear from some folks as well about how their homework assignment went from the past time, or if you're joining us for the first time, who is someone that you'd like to have a transformative conversation with and why. So we'll give you a few short minutes, we'll send you small rooms, and then we'll bring you all back in about 5 minutes or so. Oh, actually, you know what? Before I do that, I'm going to copy these into the chat. So if you want to refer back to these questions, you'll be able to see them just by clicking on the chat button. And you'll see them right there. Okay, excellent. So we'll see you in about 5 minutes. All right, welcome back. Welcome back. I see some smiles, which is always a good sign. And everyone stayed to the very end, which is also a good sign. Hope the conversations went well. Hope the homework went well. I'd love to hear from you all, actually, and I ask y'all to be brave. And if someone would like to unmute and maybe share a bit, either on how their homework went of having that transformative conversation with someone, multiple throughout, right? Or if you weren't able to, and you'd like to share on who is someone in your life that you'd like to have a transformative conversation with. Maybe what is that issue? What is the reason why? And then I think we have time for maybe like 2 folks that can share. So normally what's easiest for us so we can see everyone, since we have multiple screens, is you go to your reactions and press the raise a hand feature. That pops you up right to the front of our screen. And that's the easiest way for us to call on you. And it starts up a little queue as well. So if you're feeling brave, I'd love to open it up and have someone share a bit about how their small group time went. All right, Terry, thank you.
Okay, I'll be brave.
Thank
I had
you.
a great conversation with Tom, and we're like-minded souls, but neither one of us came last month. But we were talking about who are the people we would like to have these conversations with. And he mentioned his sisters, and I mentioned my cousins. And then we came to that question of, can you really do it? Can you really have this conversation? For myself, I'll just speak for myself. I feel like I'm extremely judgmental, and I'm not sure I would be a really good listener, as you were talking about listening. I just haven't developed that skill. So the best I can do is when I talk to my cousins, we discuss their kids, the weather, whatever else. But what's really on my heart, I don't talk to them, because if I say to them, you know, Well, I think that students ought to be given $10,000 debt relief because they're poor, a lot of them. And I know they're going to jump all over me. So I don't say that stuff, but I would love to.
Mm. Well, Terry, thank you so much for sharing, for the vulnerability and the courage in sharing as well. What we talked about with the transformative conversation is part of a workshop that we give. We have resources available on that too. So if that's something that's of interest, we'd be happy to share that in any kind of follow-up as well. So you can browse through that at your own pace. But yeah, it's true. Bridge work, bridge making is a calling, right? Oftentimes. And sometimes it's about when is the right time. Sometimes it's about who is the right person. So I think it's just as much of a discernment, recognizing where our calling is in that. So thank you for highlighting that in your sharing.
And I think you also named something really important, that listening is a skill. It's a muscle that needs practice and patience to develop. So patience with yourself, patience with, those around you. Not a skill that I've always had, still struggle with it sometimes. So I think we can all, work on that, but it's worth doing, I have found.
Yeah, thank you. Awesome. Paul.
We didn't get to who we'd like to talk with, but I, based on my conversation with another person here online, and I'll save her name to protect the innocent, but I would love to be in a room with several key bishops and a few other select bishops and have them talk about social justice and how it relates to politics. I would love to listen in on that conversation with a few chat lines with certain ones.
Okay, great point. Thank you so much, Paul. Yeah, definitely the idea of who we can have in that room. I love that. Thank you for bringing that up. Awesome. If we have time for one more, if someone else wants to. If not, we can move it along and pass it over to Sister Emily as well. Yes, if anyone else feels like it, you can raise a hand. If not, I can pass it over to Sister Emily.
All right. Well, looks like I'll take over then. So we're going to talk a little bit about messaging strategy now. And really, the one rule you need to keep in mind when you're thinking about messaging is this: tell an easily understandable, cohesive, and inclusive story. So I want you to think for yourselves. We're going to have some more conversation. What is the story that our opposition tells? So if we want to build an inclusive, multiracial democracy, what is the story that our opposition tells? And you can either put a word or phrase in the chat or raise your hand and just answer verbally. What are some pieces of the story that our opposition tells? People of color are lazy and undeserving. All are socialists. That socialists word. Anyone else want to jump in? Ed, yeah.
They want to take over.
Who is they that want to take over?
Right, they.
Ed, I saw your hand up.
There's not enough money.
Not enough money. Yes, the scarcity story.
In America, there's never enough money to love her.
Yeah. And I'm seeing in the chat that poor people need to work hard and that if they work hard, they can make it. Release criminal versus reduce prison population. That social justice is Marxist and anti-God with an intent to divide us. Yeah, you're all getting some pretty key pieces of the story. And one piece of the story that a lot of these comments are getting at is what we call dog whistle politics. So if you think of a dog whistle, it's a whistle that's at a pitch that dogs can hear, and it riles them up, but we as humans might not be able to hear it. So we're like, why is the dog getting all antsy? Why is the dog reacting this way? So dog whistle politics is a term coined by Ian Haney Lopez. So let's hear what he has to say about this. Oops. Takes a second for it to come up with a YouTube start. There we go.
Welcome to Race Class Academy. The goal is to explain ideas and insights that can help you work with others to build.
I'm not sure what happened. Let's try again.
Welcome to Race Class Academy. The goal is to explain ideas and insights that can help you work with others to build a multiracial progressive majority. Level 1, dog whistle politics. It's the main political weapon we face, and you can trace it to this man. In 1963, Barry Goldwater and his faction within the Republican Party wanted to return the country to a time when the government mainly worked for the wealthy. The previous time, corporate greed had tanked the economy and triggered the Great Depression. After that, we embraced the New Deal. We as a country understood that government must play an essential role in regulating corporations, creating ladders of upward mobility, and ensuring that economic winners pay their fair share. That's how we grew the largest middle class the world had ever seen. Goldwater campaigned against the New Deal, but he knew his economic agenda was unpopular, so he came up with an outrageous strategy. Here's what conservative journalist Robert Novak reported. Perhaps a majority of the party's leadership envisioned substantial political gold to be mined in the racial crisis by becoming, in fact, though not in name, the white man's party. The racial crisis? That was the civil rights movement. In fact, but not in name? Here's where Goldwater innovated. He would promote white supremacy, but do so using code. For instance, Goldwater would shout about law and order, as if he was talking about crime in general, rather than spreading the lie that black civil rights protesters were violent hoodlums. This is dog whistle politics. It allows politicians to promote social hatreds, especially but not only racism, while pretending they honor equality. Goldwater would lose, but dog whistle politics won. 1964 would be the last year a Democratic candidate for president would win a majority of the white vote. Next up, racism as a weapon of the rich.
So that's part of a series called the Race Class Academy that you can find online. And I can pass along a link to include in the follow-up email. But the goal here is to recognize that the dog whistle story comes across as a cohesive story, that we blame people of color for the crisis that we are facing or the tension that we are facing or all of our problems. And by doing so, we can split people from their own self-interest, particularly white people. We can divide white people from their own self-interest because it's a little bit better to be a poor white person than it is to be a person of color in a highly racist society. So in order to compete with this narrative, we must tell an alternative story that is cohesive and easily to understand and easily repeatable and true. And we want to get people riled up so that they take action. We want to convince people to take action. We want to motivate people to take action. And so to do that, we lay out a compelling vision. This is the world we want to see, and we can do it. What we don't do is repeat or refute opposition talking points. Because when we do that, it does two things. First is it instigates the backfire effect. So for those who were at last month's session, you heard about the backfire effect in personal conversations. It's this primal fight or flight response in our reptilian brains that causes us, spikes our adrenaline, and actually psychologically has the impact of causing us to believe even more strongly in our original position when we are presented with facts that counteract our original position. So facts don't always help. What we need to do is, without repeating the story, develop a narrative that can counteract that story. The other reason that we don't want to repeat or even directly refute opposition talking points is, if you think about those myth fact kind of sheets that people tend to hand out, the myth is X and the fact is Y. What psychological research has actually shown us is that what people actually walk away from those with is remembering the myth even more strongly and forgetting the fact that refuted the myth. So we don't ever want to repeat the talking points that are inaccurate, which is really hard to do. And that's why it's so important to name that is a strategic approach to messaging. And so I'm going to lay out a framework here called the race-class narrative that is a really powerful framework in getting this message across. And so to do that, I'm going to show you an example of an ad produced by the folks at We Make the Future. And I'm going to have you, after you watch the ad, I'm going to have you respond to me or to all of us. What is it that you notice? You can either type it in the chat or, again, raise your hand and speak it out loud.
In our communities, we rely on each other. Day after day, we get the job done. We do our part. When corporations dodge taxes and hold down wages, they leave us holding the bag. So cut the bull. Tell our state representatives to make corporations pay what they owe us.
All right. So what did you notice?
Sounds pretty tough.
Sounds tough. Okay. Joanne, I think
community.
Community. Yeah, thanks,
Not
Kathleen.
individual.
Yes, the we. Yes.
The solidarity.
Okay. Say more about that.
It's not just we, it makes it sound like all of us, because we're in the we, even whoever's listening's in the we, and we do our part, we get it done. And it goes through a list of we make this happen.
Yeah. And I think the images really reinforce that, right? If you were watching the images, you saw people from a variety of races. Yes, Anne just put that in the chat. Great job. Claire also added hardworking, the sense of most of us are hardworking and we want to contribute to our communities. We're not these, we're not these selfish, lazy folks that people make us out to be when they want to divide us, that people we're more alike than maybe sometimes we think. Anyone else? All right, so let's get into a little more depth of the race-class narrative framework, and then we'll see some more examples and we can start to put those pieces together. But I think you're already picking up on some of these key pieces, so I love that. So the race-class narrative, because messaging matters. And so the idea is that this framework promotes a positive, inclusive vision by naming values. We lead with values, who we are and what we value. Identify the community. And so this can be verbally or through images. You saw the images of a diverse group of people. You might say, if you were doing some sort of written or spoken without imagery text, you could do whether we are Black, brown, or white. Most of us believe that working hard and contributing to our communities is important. No matter what zip code we live in, most of us believe that all children should have their basic needs met. Those sorts of things where we explicitly name race and class, or implicitly name race and class in the example of the zip code. Then we want to name the villain. So you heard the villain. Who is the villain in that ad?
Rich corporations.
Rich corporations, yes. And why? So why is that they are dodging taxes and dividing us against each other? Because they want to rig the economy in their favor. So then we have a call to come together across differences or divisions So again, that across differences or divisions is really implied in the imagery, but there's this idea of we're calling everyone together to take an action, to tell our representatives to make corporations pay us what they owe us. And then we name the vision. So that idea that we are building this better world together. A couple of quick notes. When we name the villain, we want to be as specific as possible, and recognizing we are a nonpartisan space, we might say something like certain politicians or a few ultra wealthy people and their political cronies. To have an effective story, we have to have a villain, because otherwise our brains fill in the gap. That's just something about the way we are as people. We like to have a villain. We like to have something to kind of grasp onto. And that's one of the reasons our opposition's storytelling is so effective, because they name a clear villain. Unfortunately, the villain they tend to name is not really the villain of the story. They scapegoat, they use what we call racial scapegoating to identify a villain to divide us against each other, right? And there's a critical piece in all of this, in the framing of this, is that certain politicians, some people, we really want to separate it so that we're not vilifying the people that we're talking to, because of that backfire effect, right? If people think we're talking about, all people that fit this category, all politicians, all business persons, there are a lot of people who work in business that are really good people, and there are a lot of business leaders that support the policies and values that we want to see take place. And so that critical word of certain, or the limiting word, is really very important. And then the last piece is we've done it before and we can do it again. Because that really illustrates, especially when we can name a specific thing. We've done it before and we can do it again. So let's look at a few, let's look at another way of looking at this. So this is a four-step process that really encompasses the same things, but looks at specific versions of a narrative. To start with, lead with a shared value that names race and class. So for example, you might say, every child, regardless of where they come from, what they look like, or where they live, deserves an opportunity to pursue their dreams. And what we found, and not me, I haven't done the research, but what the researchers have found that have really done the work to develop this messaging is that explicitly naming race and class doesn't actually turn white people off. We're okay talking about race and racism. But when we don't name race and class, when we ignore the dog whistles, then that's where we really get into trouble, because those dog whistles stoke that racial resentment and we don't counteract that. So regardless of where they come from, what they look like, or where they live, really gets at that. We want to be inclusive. And then we want to name racial scapegoating as a weapon that economically harms all of us. But greedy politicians and their corporate lobbyists funding them put our communities against each other based on what we look like or where we come from, making us believe that we can't have what we need so that they can rig the economy for themselves. So naming racial scapegoating as a weapon that harms us all, and why, and that why piece helps with our listener to really buy in or believe the narrative that we're telling. And then we want to emphasize unity and collective action to solve the problem or problems. We are building momentum, we are building action, and people don't act when they feel hopeless. And so naming the things that we can do to overcome this. Together, we have the power to demand that leaders do right by all children, regardless of where they live. And then we want to connect that collective action to a specific call to action as to what it will do to achieve our desired outcome. So give a call to action, urging people to be active participants in creating change. They know when we come together, we're powerful, and we're making our nation a place where all of our communities have what we need to thrive. We need your vote with us as a voter on November 8th. So some examples of the different pieces of that. And I'm going to name that not every single narrative is going to have all of these pieces, because the goal is that together we're telling a cohesive story. So I'm actually going to offer a couple other examples and ask you all to reflect on what pieces of this narrative you see in these examples. So strategic racism is a real thing. Certain politicians promote racial conflict as a strategy to divide and distract people so they can get and hold on to power. What do you notice?
Well, they say certain politicians.
Certain politicians. Very good, Dominica. Making it very limited. And especially, I'm going to add on to my earlier framework about the word certain, because especially when it comes to talking about politicians, there are folks in our opposition that will blanketly use all politicians as the villain, right? You hear that. We want that certain politicians because we don't want to make that idea, we don't want to expand that idea that all politicians are bad, because we want to build a government that works for us. We know we can. And so we don't want to spread the narrative that all politicians are bad and thus that government is bad. Because we believe that government can be a force for good. What else do you all notice?
The first line, strategic racism is a real thing. It specifically names it.
Yeah, and calls it strategic. Yeah, it's a strategy. Yeah. What else?
That it's a way to distract people.
To distract people, yes. And why are they distracting people?
So they won't think about what's the real truth.
Okay. What about in this statement? Why are they distracting people?
They can hold on to power.
So they can get and hold on to power. It's about power. So a fun thing about this statement is this is actually one of the statements that Ian Haney Lopez, who you saw in that video, that first video, did some testing on. And what he found is that even though this isn't the full race class narrative model, this statement pulls excessively well. 81% of Latinx people agreed with this statement. 84% of Black people polled agreed with the statement, and 79% of white people polled agreed with this statement. And that's among people who probably haven't heard the word strategic racism before. That buy-in tends to increase the more that we hear it. And if you've never heard this before and are getting those kinds of results, just think what happens when we continue to make this the new common sense by talking about it. So I think this is a really important thing to talk about, because the way that we message things really makes a difference. So I'm going to play one more video and ask you again to reflect on this.
We want our communities to be healthy and vibrant. And so we march together
to demand justice.
While a handful of politicians try to make us fear each other,
we're onto them. And we count on us.
And so we turn up.
And we turn out as voters.
To make this a place where liberty and justice are for all.
For all.
For all.
Para todos.
Vote.
All right. What did you notice?
I noticed that there were a lot of Black people in this. To me, that was a good thing.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And Hispanics.
Mm-hmm.
That last line jumped out because just last few days we were on something else and said, please do not use vote, use be a voter.
Yes. Yes. That identity piece. Voting is something we do and we can do it or not, and it's fine. But if we are a voter, that sense of identity is so powerful. Great pickup, Rose. Rosie says in the chat, started with their shared values, the community that we want to build, right? What else?
Well, it seems to be more about unity and togetherness and we. There's a lot of we statements in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
All statements too.
All.
For all.
Yeah. For all. For all. Yeah, that's a piece of that cross-racial solidarity. And I honestly don't know who created what this ad was specifically created for. But I do think that I do know that some of the ads that are available to us for use for this example, it's We Make the Future is the group that does a lot of this work. And some of the ads that they provide for free for people to use were made specifically for Black communities, motivating Black communities. And this might be one of them, which might be why you saw mostly people of color. All right, so let's talk a little bit about why this narrative works, and then we will move on. So first thing I want to ask you is, this is going to sound like a random question, but stick with me for a minute. Y'all know Miracle Whip? Any Miracle Whip fans out here?
Not a fan, but of course we know it.
You know it? Okay. So do you know what percentage of their advertising budget Miracle Whip spends targeting their most devoted users? It is between 75 and 90% of their marketing budget goes to marketing to their most devoted users. Any idea why?
So they can spread it?
So they can spread the word, right? Like if I came up to you and said, and like I had made this let's say I made a potato salad and you loved it. And I said, well, it was made with Miracle Whip. Maybe you should try Miracle Whip in your next potato salad. You might be more likely to do that than if you just saw an Instagram post or a Facebook post for Miracle Whip or an ad on TV. That word of mouth, that idea of trusted relationships is really central to effective marketing strategies. And that's really also, like we talked about this in Transformative Conversations, it's also central to some of that. And so we're going to look a little bit at the audience theory, and then we're going to define some terms. So the audience theory of race-class narrative is really kind of like the work of the Miracle Whip marketing executives. Our goal with the way we tell our story is to engage or mobilize our base, persuade the persuadables. In one narrative, we can engage and mobilize the base, persuade those who are persuadable. And if we tell the narrative effectively, what we also know is that we're going to alienate the opposition. So the reality is, for too long, certain politicians have tried to appeal to the center by repeating the opposition's talking points, by becoming far right light. That's why we need to be clear that we can persuade the persuadables without appealing to the opposition. And so we're alienating the oppositions. That's actually a goal because it means we're saying something worth saying. We don't want just some milquetoast vision that anyone could agree with. We wanted to lay out a compelling vision to stand up for immigrants and asylum seekers, to boldly proclaim that Black Lives Matter and more. We are proclaiming something worth proclaiming. And often that does alienate the opposition. But it can also, the race class narrative model has shown that it can also engage and mobilize the base and persuade the persuadables, and thus it's effective messaging. So here's our audience. Just some quick definitions. Our activists and advocates might include some folks like you, less than 1% of the population, but people who spend a significant amount of time digging deep and taking action on political issues. So the question that I want to ask you is the way we talk to each other really effective with the rest of the population? If I go around saying systemic racism is bad to the random person on the street, are they going to even know what I'm talking about? Probably not. And so it's really important to make sure that our language isn't stuck in the jargony way that we talk to each other. Yeah, Terry.
Okay, I hope you understand what I'm going to say. In your speech, you say people of color several times.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like to be called a person of color. I'm Black.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be known as a Black person.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to be a person of color. To me, that's just BS. I don't like it. And I don't think very many Black people like it either. Because a person of color, I don't know, I guess I think of some brown-skinned Hawaiian person. I don't know what a person of color looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that is language that I just don't care for. Since, anyway, you mentioned language, so that's my 2 cents.
Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I will acknowledge that it's imperfect. And usually I try to use it when I'm talking about people who are Black and other people of color as well. And I try to use Black when I'm talking specifically about the Black community. But I'm imperfect at that too. So thank you for naming that. And I will continue to try to be better at that. So going on back to the audience piece, the base is about 25% of the voting public, and they generally agree on our values regarding race and government and wealth and so forth. They're the super users of the Mayo or of the Miracle Whip, or they're the choir for mixing metaphors. And so they consistently vote with our values, but they may or may not take other action. They need to be activated and encouraged to do so. And so the goal of our messaging is to activate people in that category to take action. The persuadables are about 50% of the voting public, and they tend to have conflicting views or mixed minds. They jump back and forth on their beliefs, depending on the story they hear most often and the story they understand the best. So again, the story they hear most often, so repeatable, and the story they understand the best, which is where we want to be particularly careful about any jargon that we might use. So in general, they support progressive policies, but are often lured by the opponent's narratives on race, wealth, government, and gender, because these messages are simple, persuasive, and frequently repeated. And then we have the opposition, which is 25% of the voting public. They're probably never going to agree with us on anything. And the villains, which would be less than 1% of the voting public, the people who rig this system and pull the strings in their favor. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about the audience and how we engage the audience. And just some last specific tips on language, in addition to what Terry shared with us, is be as precise as possible. So I think that's really important to name. If we're talking about something like a policy like reparations, we want to talk about Black Americans. If we're talking about anti-Asian hate, we're going to be talking about Asian Americans. Those sorts of things being as specific to the community impacted by a particular policy. It is important that we get comfortable talking about race and racism. And that's actually an interesting phrase, because the political message testing has shown that people across all races respond more positively to let's talk about race and racism than they do to how they respond to let's talk about racism. People are much more willing to talk about race and racism than they are willing to talk about racism. And so that simple change of phrase can be really powerful in opening doors to conversation. But it is important to talk about the inequities and the harm that Black and Brown people experience every day. And so we want to name things that are racist policies. We can't address racism and end the power it has over our policies if we don't talk about it. And because naming race and racism and how it has been used to divide us leads us to reject that vision, enables us to see and reject that division and work together to build a world for all of us. Be specific, as I said. Talk about when the federal highway system tore up Black communities across the entire country, stripping wealth from generations of Black families. Talk about the GI Bill that benefited white families but left out families of color, particularly Black families, right? That we can name those things explicitly so that people know what it is that we're talking about. Name how the internment of Japanese citizens during World War II tore them from their communities and stole wealth, businesses, and homes from countless families. Use simple language, avoid jargon like systemic racism. And so one good rule of thumb is use language a 7-year-old could understand. And we as activists and advocates can talk to each other about systemic racism and understand what we mean by that. But saying that in public is like my doctor friend talking to me about a myocardial infarction. I got no idea what she means. So it just rolls right over me and it doesn't integrate. I don't take it in. It doesn't break my heart open to see the truth of how policies and how policies in this country have explicitly harmed Black and Brown people throughout our history and into the present day. When it just rolls over my head, I can't have my heart broken open at the realities. Use positive and inclusive language. Build a vision that people want to be a part of and that people are willing to do the hard work to help create. And finally, one just last fun little tip is that our economy, instead of the economy, is a really good, simple switch up. Our economy is inclusive, and it also subtly reinforces the reality that there's more than one way to build an economy, and we get to choose the kind of economy we build as our economy. Certainly, these aren't all the tips available, but I think this is a good place to start. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Colin. Thank you all for some great conversation. Colin's going to talk about letters to the editor.
Awesome. Thank you, Sister Emily. So yeah, now that we heard about messaging and understood that framework, especially through the race class narrative, what are the specific ways that we can put that into practice besides the conversations that we have with loved ones or other individuals? A great way to do that is through a letter to the editor. And I feel like we have some very involved folks here, so I'm sure folks have submitted some letters to editor before. I'm curious, as just by a raise of hand or so, has anyone submitted a letter to the editor before to a local publication? Oh, perfect. Yeah, a lot of hands here. We got some experts here. Perfect. So this will be a nice review for most of y'all. For anyone that hasn't done it yet, we hope to give you some insight into how to do that and to apply this race class narrative messaging that we were talking about in a way so that we can help other folks be bought into this idea of building this multiracial and inclusive society, and doing so through that lens of being a Pope Francis voter. So letters to the editor are widely read local content. And this is one of the parts of a local publication that members of Congress pay very specific attention to. Whenever their name gets mentioned in a letter to the editor that's published or an op-ed, they literally get a ping, right? They have a whole person on staff that's dedicated to making sure and tracking to see what folks are saying, especially when it comes from a local publication. So it's very, very, folks are very aware of that one. Campaigns around letters to the editors, LTE, if you hear me say LTE, it's letters to the editor, can create movements, right? Because it not just it brings awareness not just to the office, but to the general public as well. So since all of y'all, well, many folks here have done it before, I'm sure this won't be anything new, but we have a specific way that that we go about it, that we help folks do their training, especially when it's younger advocates or folks who haven't done that for the first time. So with that, we're going to give you a quick rundown, a 3-step process of what that looks like. For us, it's very simple. It's with starting with your qualifications, telling them what you think, and bringing it all together with a legislative ask at the end. So I'm going to go into detail with each of these with an example of what that can look like. And as you go through that, keeping in mind that messaging framework of the race class narrative, how we can include that into there as well. So to kick things off, we start off first with starting with your qualifications. You want to let them know who you are. And if you have a title, be sure to use that, being proud of that and really leading with that, right? If you're a constituent, if you're a member of a specific community, really being clear in naming that. So an example that we have is, as a multi-issue Catholic voter, I cannot stay silent while, let's call him Congressman Jones, vilifies people who are incarcerated in his February 10th op-ed, "Criminals don't deserve handouts." So right away, you're starting with the identification, with your qualification of who you're coming in as, and you're naming the congressperson and the policy, and you're referencing, if it's in response to something, another piece that you're responding to in that letter to the editor, which is very important because it'll hit off all those pings for those different folks. Next, you move into telling them what you think. And that's where you get to dive in and then share your thoughts on the issue. As why, as a multi-issue voter, that piece that you're responding to is struck you or had a type of response that you want to share. And that's what we can see with this example that we have. Federal policies and harsh sentencing laws have led to the U.S. having the highest percentage of people who are incarcerated in the world. A focus on punishment rather than rehabilitation has taken its toll on vulnerable communities by deepening racial divides and reinforcing a cycle of poverty. If we're to use that idea of the race class narrative, we can name the fact that Black folks are disproportionately affected and incarcerated, right? And that doesn't just affect a community there, but in a countywide and statewide can affect the property values of other folks around there, right? So we see that it can affect multiple people, tying us all together, but that we can overcome this. Which leads to that last part, bringing it together with a legislative ask. In the final piece, you get to bring forth what you think should be done about it. And here we can see keeping in tune with that idea of being, as they present themselves as a multi-issue Catholic voter, saying that I pray that Congressman Jones opens his heart and listens to his constituents. We cannot continue to tolerate racism in our criminal legal system or the loss of another generation to mass incarceration. Catholic voters like me expect Congressman Jones to support the Equal Act, which is one of the pieces that we have a campaign on most recently in the past 2 years, that we're actually very excited to see some very positive movement on it. Seeing that it might actually be passed very, very soon. All that through the actions around campaigns like letters to the editor. Now we have a couple of pro tips that we want to share with you all as well. One, of course, is just finding your local paper's rules. It might be different depending on what area that you're in, depending on the publication that you're writing to as well. If you look up their letter to the editor piece, if they still have that, they'll give you all the specifics that are needed for their for publishing a letter to the editor through them as well. But generally for an LTE, since those are shorter than an op-ed, you would want to keep those to around 150 to 200 words. That's the general rule of thumb. But again, keeping in mind what the specific recommendations are for each of your local paper's rules. Next is finding issue coverage. Mentioning the coverage of your issue in your letter. Timeliness is key. If this is in response to something that was written in the previous issue, that's always a key as well, that publications want to see as folks engaging with and responding to. So oftentimes timeliness is just as key when you respond to one of those pieces. And some other quick tips that we have for y'all is that obviously you can write to multiple local papers, but making sure that you're specifically addressing, who it is that you're writing to and making sure that all those details are correct. You don't want to have just one boilerplate one for everything, but knowing that you can send it out to multiple there. And normally, if you're going to repeat, especially with a specific local paper, you're going to want to wait about 3 weeks before you repeat sending one in again there as well. So just some tips from our communications team that they offer us that we share in our trainings too. And that if you have not submitted a letter to the editor yet, we encourage you to do so, to try it out, especially during this midterm election season, and doing so using that messaging that we've learned about a little bit earlier today. There are other ways to get involved as well. Get out the vote campaigns and ways that you can mobilize folks in your area, again, by using that same framework, that messaging and of sharing values, of connecting to the community, building the we, identifying what villain is causing an issue and a divide within the community, but overcoming that together, right? So get out the vote efforts are so key in those areas, especially if you're in one of those very contentious races coming up. Canvassing, just letting folks know when you're engaged in tactics for educating the general public. Canvassing is always great to be doing as well. And of course, working the polls. If you've done any of these, we thank you so much, because that is just as important of the work that we do. And if you haven't done so yet, this midterm season is a great time to start and to jump into that too. And we highly encourage it. All right. And with that, I'll pass it back to Sister Emily.
All right. So last call, be a voter. The present and future of our democracy are on the line this year. We need, it may only be midterm election, but don't take only too seriously. Excuse me. Got a tickle in my throat. We need 2020 level turnout. It's up to you to help make that happen. Colin, can you take this over? I can't talk right now.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, as Sister Emily was saying, we can't take this midterms for granted. We want just as much turnout as that record-breaking 2020 level that we can do here through any of these tactics that we had mentioned, using that messaging of framework of the race class narrative. And again, whether that's LTE campaigns, whether that's a get out the vote effort, canvassing, or working at the polls. We need that so that Pope Francis voters like yourselves can make themselves known as well into there too. So next, we also encourage you to check out Turbo Vote. If you haven't done so yet, you can check your registration if you're registered to vote and get other reminders. When you go through that, obviously you can go to Turbo Vote. We have it on our website, networklobby.org/turbovote. Very easy way to be able to check that information and get reminders for your local elections and everything that's coming up there, if you're not already informed on those pieces. And from there, again, it would also not be a network presentation if we didn't leave you with a little bit of homework too. So for this one, if you have not done so yet, we encourage you to have one conversation per week up until the election, whenever for you. Have a conversation that's focused around that race class narrative framework. It can be tough, but it's so key for us as multi-issue voters to be able to bring those up, especially with those persuadable folks in our lives, the people that we're in relationship with, that we know we can bring into and bring along with us in that work. And if you haven't done so yet, write a letter to the editor using the techniques that we showed in this presentation here. We're happy to share a copy of the slides afterwards in a follow-up if you want to take a look at that. But of course, if you go onto our website at Network Lobby, we have plenty of other trainings and recordings and other resources that are available to you to be able to be engaged in that work. But we encourage you to get active, to participate in that. I know we have so many folks here that are so active in this, and we thank you so much for doing that, because it's a key time. And we know that for Pope Francis voters like us, we really need that additional work to continue to be done. And we thank you for that. So with that, we're finishing up, and I know we have some time for a little bit of questions, so we can pass that over to Jack if there's anything. But at least on our end, we want to thank you all for the attention, for the time this afternoon or evening in joining us. And we look forward to continuing to do the work with you all to be those Pope Francis multi-issue voters this midterm election season.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Sister Emily. I'm just going to open it up briefly to see if there are any sort of concluding questions before we sign off tonight. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask either one of our presenters a question if you like. Well, hearing none, let me just propose that Leela will be sending an email to all of you on Monday of next week, Leela, with a video link of tonight's presentation. And the thought crosses my mind that using this video in your home church or with a key group that you're a part of might be a significant way of getting the word out and getting other people engaged. So let me encourage you to use this video widely when you receive it next week. Also, in that email that you'll be receiving will be an invitation for you to join the Just Faith Network. Almost every week, we have some kind of resource that we send to all members of the network at no charge. So please take advantage of this offering. Let me also pause and double back and thank Colin and Sister Emily for being with us for the last 2 months. Could I invite everybody a little round of applause for our good friends from Network? Thank you both so much. This was just very, very helpful. Finally, I'd like to invite you to next month's Acting for Justice event on Thursday, October 20th. Author Bob Hunter will address the topic of a durable spirituality with a presentation entitled Surviving Hard Times, Lessons for All of Us from the Black Church. We hope you'll join us. I'll close our time together now with a short prayer from Bishop Desmond Tutu. Let us pray. Look back from where we have come. The path was at times an open road of joy, at others a steep and bitter track of stones and pain. But how could we know the joy without the suffering? And how could we endure the suffering but that we are warmed and carried on the breast of God? Amen. Thank you all again for being with us. And until next month, we at Just Faith Ministries wish you well. Thank you for joining us. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.